You've been lied to about medieval times your entire life. While you were taught they were dirty and backwards, they were actually pioneering technologies we can't replicate today. But the most shocking truth, one medieval invention was so dangerous, the church banned it forever. Back in 1518, the city of Strasbourg witnessed something that would make today's flash mobs look like child's play. A woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into the street and began dancing. Nothing unusual there, right? Well, she didn't stop. For days. Within a week, dozens joined her. Not by choice, mind you. They simply couldn't help themselves. Their feet moved against their will, spinning and leaping until they collapsed from exhaustion. The authorities, bless their medieval hearts, thought hiring musicians would help, because clearly what uncontrollable dancers needed was a better beat. By the end of the month, around 400 people were trapped in this bizarre dance marathon. Some danced themselves to death. Literally. Heart attacks, strokes, sheer exhaustion. Makes your worst wedding reception look pretty tame, doesn't it? Modern scientists believe it was mass hysteria brought on by extreme stress and ergot poisoning from contaminated bread. The people of Strasbourg were dealing with famine, disease, and social upheaval. Their minds simply snapped under pressure. The dancing plague wasn't unique to Strasbourg either. Similar outbreaks popped up across Europe throughout the medieval period. Entire communities would lose control of their bodies, dancing until they dropped. But if you think medieval justice was limited to punishing humans, wait until you hear what they did to animals who broke the law. But here's where medieval justice gets truly bizarre. Animals weren't just witnesses to crimes, they were the actual defendants. Picture this. A pig sits in a medieval courtroom, complete with a judge, jury, and even a defense attorney. Sounds like a comedy sketch, right? Well, it happened regularly throughout Europe. In 1386, a pig was literally put on trial for biting a child. The pig lost. Badly. These weren't just random village pranks either. We're talking full legal proceedings with all the pomp and circumstance of human trials. Locusts faced charges for crop destruction. Rats got summoned for theft. One particularly memorable case involved an entire colony of termites being excommunicated from the church for property damage. The legal system treated these cases with dead serious professionalism. Animals received proper representation, actual lawyers who argued their cases with straight faces. Makes you wonder what those law school classes were like, doesn't it? Some defendants even won their cases. Occasionally, animals were simply exiled instead of executed. Imagine being the guy whose job was to escort a cow out of town and make sure it never returned. This wasn't about justice as we understand it today. Medieval. Courts believed morality extended beyond humans to all of creation. Every living thing was accountable to God's law. But speaking of peculiar medieval medical practices, wait until you hear about their approach to healing through starvation. Medieval doctors had some pretty wild ideas about health, but none quite as bizarre as their obsession with water fasting. These physicians genuinely believed that avoiding food and drinking only water could cure everything from headaches to demonic possession. Well, at least they were half right about the water part. Picture this. You've got a splitting headache, and instead of reaching for willow bark tea, your local doctor prescribes 7 days of nothing but water. The theory? Your body was supposedly clogged with evil humors that only pure fasting could flush out. Monks took this even further, combining spiritual discipline with what they called medical necessity. They'd fast for weeks before major religious festivals, believing it purified both soul and stomach. Here's where it gets really weird, though. Medieval physicians actually created detailed fasting schedules based on your social class. Nobles got 3-day gentle fasts with blessed spring water, while peasants were told to tough it out for weeks with whatever water they could find. The irony? Modern science shows short-term fasting can have some health benefits, but these medieval marathons usually led to malnutrition and made people sicker than when they started. But if you think water fasting was extreme, wait until you hear what medieval surgeons did when patients had severe head injuries or mental illness. Here's something that'll make your skin crawl. Medieval doctors had a favorite cure for everything from headaches to mental illness. Drilling holes in people's skulls. Yeah, you heard that right. They called it trepanation, and it was about as pleasant as it sounds. The theory? Evil spirits or bad blood were trapped inside your head, causing all sorts of problems. So naturally, the solution was to grab a drill and make a convenient exit hole. Makes perfect sense, right? But here's the kicker. People actually survived this barbaric procedure. Archaeologists have found skulls with clear signs of bone regrowth around these holes, proving patients lived long enough for their heads to start healing. That's either incredibly lucky or surprisingly skilled surgery for an era when soap was optional. The tools they used would make a horror movie director jealous. We're talking sharpened flint, seashells, and crude metal instruments. No anesthesia, no sterile environment, just pure medieval grit and a prayer that you wouldn't bleed out on the operating table. Well, at least they were creative with their medical disasters. Speaking of creative medical practices, wait until you hear what medieval doctors could determine just by tasting your pee. Trust me, you'll never complain about modern lab tests again. Medieval doctors had a pretty strange way of diagnosing you. Forget blood tests or x-rays, they just ask for a cup of your pee and call it a day. Actually, they took urine analysis so seriously that it became the backbone of medieval medicine. These physicians would examine your urine's color, smell it, and here's the kicker, they'd actually taste it. Yeah, you heard that right. Your doctor would literally sip your pee to figure out what was wrong with you. Talk about dedication to the job. They had elaborate urine charts showing dozens of different colors, each supposedly indicating a specific disease or condition. The darker your urine, the more concerned they'd get. Clear meant you were healthy, cloudy suggested fever, and reddish tones? Well, that meant trouble was brewing inside. Some doctors claimed they could diagnose everything from kidney stones to pregnancy just by examining urine samples. Now, before you laugh too hard, this wasn't completely ridiculous. They were actually onto something. Modern medicine still uses urine tests today. But medieval doctors took it way too far, believing they could diagnose mental illness and predict death from a single sample. The weirdest part? Some physicians never even bothered examining the actual patient. Just bring them a jar of pee and they'd write you a prescription. But speaking of weird medieval treatments, wait until you hear what they made people wear. Laws from medieval times didn't just control crime. They controlled what you wore to dinner. Sumptuary laws were the dress codes from hell, dictating exactly who could wear what. Think your workplace has strict rules? Try living in an era where wearing the wrong color could land you in jail. These laws weren't suggestions. They were serious business. A peasant caught strutting around in silk-faced hefty fines, sometimes worse. The idea was simple. Keep everyone in their lane through fashion policing. Purple was basically off-limits to commoners. Why? Because purple dye cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Makes sense, right? Only royalty and high nobility could afford such extravagance, so naturally they wanted to keep it exclusive. But here's the kicker. Even if you somehow scraped together enough money for fancy fabric, the law still said no. Wealth alone wasn't enough. You needed the right bloodline or title to match your wardrobe. Bright colors, fine furs, jewelry with actual precious stones, all reserved for the upper crust. Think of it like medieval copyright protection, except instead of protecting ideas, they were protecting social status through clothing. Breaking these rules wasn't just embarrassing, it was expensive and sometimes dangerous. Well, speaking of dangerous medieval practices, wait until you hear about how they made their ink. Medieval scribes had a secret weapon that made their manuscripts survive longer than most modern books. Their ink wasn't just any mixture, it was crafted from oak tree gall. Nuts, those weird little bumps you've probably walked past without a second thought. Here's the kicker. When wasps lay eggs in oak branches, the tree fights back by forming these crusty growths. Medieval ink makers would collect these galls, crush them up, and mix them with iron sulfate and gum arabic. The result? Ink so chemically stable it could outlast empires. But wait, it gets weirder. Some recipes called for wine as an ingredient. Not because scribes were tipsy on the job, though that would explain some of those wonky illuminated letters. The alcohol actually helped preserve the mixture and made it flow better across parchment. The whole process was like medieval chemistry class. Artisans guarded their recipes like state secrets, passing them down through generations. One wrong ratio and your precious manuscript would fade faster than a politician's campaign promise. Today's fountain pen enthusiasts still recreate these ancient formulas. Makes you wonder what our descendants will think of our ballpoint pens and laser printers, right? Speaking of medieval medical practices that seem bizarre by today's standards, let me tell you about their approach to bloodletting. medieval doctors had a slimy solution for just about everything: leeches. These blood-sucking worms were the aspirin of the Middle Ages, prescribed for headaches, fevers, and even broken hearts. Well, maybe not broken hearts, but you get the idea. The theory was simple. People believed your body contained 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much blood? Time to drain some out. And what better way than letting a bunch of hungry leeches have at it? Doctors kept these little vampires in special jars like a medieval medicine cabinet that could bite back. Some physicians became so attached to their leeches, they named them. Imagine calling your doctor and hearing, "Sorry, Gertrude is having lunch on another patient right now." But here's the kicker. Leech farms were actually a booming business. Entrepreneurs bred millions of these creatures specifically for medical use. Think Amazon warehouses, but squishier and more disgusting. The weirdest part? Sometimes it actually worked. Not because of the humor balancing nonsense, but because leeches produce natural blood thinners. Modern surgeons still use them today for certain procedures, especially when reattaching fingers or ears. Of course, medieval patients didn't know about blood thinners. They just knew that after losing a pint of blood, they felt different. Speaking of feeling different, wait until you hear how they settled legal disputes. When someone wronged you in medieval times, forget calling a lawyer. You could literally fight for justice. Trial by combat was a completely legal way to settle disputes, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Picture this: 2 guys arguing over who owns a cow. Instead of presenting evidence, they grab swords and beat the hell out of each other until one gives up or dies. The winner? Obviously, telling the truth according to God's will. Makes perfect sense, right? Well, not really. But medieval people believed divine intervention would guide the righteous to victory. It's like saying whoever wins at arm wrestling must be morally superior. The logic was bulletproof if you didn't think about it too hard. Here's where it gets interesting, though. Women could participate, but they weren't expected to duke it out themselves. Smart move. Instead, they could hire a champion to fight on their behalf. Basically, medieval lawyers, except they settled cases with battle axes instead of paperwork. Some trials even used symbolic weapons like wooden clubs or leather shields. Less bloody, more theatrical. Think WWE, but with actual legal consequences. The craziest part? This system lasted for centuries because people genuinely believed might made right. Physical strength equaled moral truth. Even nobles used it to resolve inheritance disputes. But speaking of strange medieval beliefs about divine intervention, medieval folks were absolutely obsessed with holy relics. We're talking about supposed body parts of saints, pieces of the cross, even vials of Jesus' blood. Sound sketchy? Well, it gets weirder. These relics weren't just sitting in dusty corners. They were rock stars of the medieval world. People would travel thousands of miles just to touch a saint's finger bone. Think of it like medieval Instagram influencers, except instead of followers, they had pilgrims. Canterbury Cathedral claimed to have Thomas Becket's skull fragments. The shrine was so popular, it basically funded the entire cathedral's construction. That's some serious saint money right there. But here's where it gets hilarious. There were supposedly enough pieces of the true cross scattered across Europe to build Noah's Ark twice over. Either Jesus was crucified on a forest, or someone was running a medieval counterfeit operation. The competition between churches was fierce. Venice literally stole St. Mark's body from Alexandria. They smuggled it out in a barrel of pork fat because Muslim guards wouldn't search anything containing pig products. Clever, right? Some relics were absolutely ridiculous. Multiple churches claimed to have Jesus' foreskin. Yes, you heard that correctly. The medieval relic game had zero chill. Well, speaking of things worth more than their weight in gold, medieval spices created trade wars that make today's oil conflicts look like playground squabbles. Picture walking into a medieval marketplace where black pepper costs more than your house. That's not an exaggeration. A pound of saffron could literally buy you a horse, and cloves were so precious that people used them as currency. These weren't just fancy seasonings, they were liquid gold flowing through trade routes that connected Europe to the far corners of Asia. Merchants risked everything crossing deserts and dodging pirates for a handful of, nutmeg. Why? Because back home, nobles would pay astronomical prices to make their bland porridge taste like something other than wet cardboard. The spice trade was basically the medieval version of cryptocurrency, except way more dangerous. Entire wars were fought over pepper routes. Venice became ridiculously wealthy just by controlling the spice highway from the east. And here's the kicker. Some landlords accepted peppercorns as rent payments. Seriously, your monthly rent could be a small bag of what we now sprinkle on our eggs without thinking twice. But the real madness? Most Europeans had never even seen these spices growing. They had wild theories about cinnamon trees guarded by giant birds or pepper that grew in snake-infested valleys. The mystery only drove prices higher. These precious seasonings didn't just flavor food, they literally shaped the world economy. Speaking of shaping things, wait until you hear what medieval cooks did to make their dinner guests scream. Medieval banquets weren't just about eating, they were full-blown theater productions. Picture this. You're sitting at a noble feast, expecting maybe some bread and meat, when suddenly a massive pie gets wheeled out. But here's the kicker. It's not filled with fruit or meat. It's stuffed with live birds that burst out when the crust is cut, flapping around the dining hall like some demented magic show. Well, that's just the appetizer for weirdness. The main course might be a roasted swan, meticulously redressed in its own feathers to look like it's still alive, or a peacock posed with its magnificent tail spread wide, because apparently medieval chefs had way too much time on their hands. These weren't just meals, they were edible art installations that would make today's food bloggers weep with envy. And the weird part is, these elaborate displays weren't even the strangest thing on the table. Almond milk was everywhere, not because they were lactose intolerant, but because regular milk spoiled faster than a teenager's mood. They used it in everything from sauces to desserts, making it the medieval equivalent of our modern oat milk obsession. The wealthy literally ate their status symbols, turning dinner into a competitive sport of who could serve the most outrageous dish. But if you think medieval dining was extravagant, wait until you hear about their tax system. Here's something that'll make your modern tax complaints seem pretty tame. Back in medieval times, there was this thing called Peter's Pence. And no, it wasn't pocket change. This was basically Europe's first international tax system. Every household in England had to cough up a penny each year to send straight to the Pope in Rome. One measly penny might not sound like much, but when you're barely scraping by as a medieval peasant, that penny could buy you a loaf of bread. The kicker? They called it voluntary. Yeah, right. About as voluntary as your boss asking you to work overtime on Friday night. The church made it crystal clear that paying up was your Christian duty, and nobody wanted to mess with eternal damnation over a penny. What's wild is how organized this whole operation was. They had collection networks spanning thousands of miles, all funneling money from muddy English villages to fancy Roman palaces. Think of it as medieval crowdfunding, except you didn't get a thank you mug. The tax supposedly bought spiritual protection from St. Peter himself. Medieval folks were essentially paying for heavenly insurance premiums, and just like modern insurance, people grumbled about it, but paid anyway. But here's where things get really strange. Sometimes the church demanded payment in ways that would make your skin crawl. Picture being a medieval woman who talked back to her husband or gossiped too much with the neighbors. Well, you'd get acquainted with one of history's most terrifying fashion accessories, the scold's bridle. This contraption looked like something from a medieval nightmare. An iron cage wrapped around your entire head, complete with a metal bit that went straight into your mouth. The bit had spikes or rough edges that would cut your tongue if you tried to speak. Lovely, right? But here's where it gets really twisted. They didn't just lock you up at home with this thing. Oh no, that would be too private. Instead, your husband or the local authorities would parade you through town wearing it. Think of it as medieval social media shaming, except way more brutal, and you couldn't delete the posts later. The whole point was public humiliation. Everyone would see you clanking through the streets, head trapped in iron, unable to defend yourself or explain your side of the story. Makes today's Twitter arguments look pretty tame by comparison. What's particularly disturbing is that men decided what counted as disorderly behavior. Disagreeing with your husband, scold's bridle, complaining about anything. Iron mask time. Then there's the fact that some of these contraptions had bells attached, ensuring maximum embarrassment as you walked. But speaking of medieval justice getting creative with punishment, picture a medieval lord facing a crucial battle decision, staring intensely into a crystal sphere. not checking his phone for weather updates, but genuinely believing this glass ball held the secrets of tomorrow. Crystal ball divination wasn't just parlor trick entertainment back then, it was serious business. Knights consulted scryers before charging into combat. Merchants gazed into crystals before investing in trade routes. Even peasants saved up coins to peer into these mystical orbs when facing life-changing choices. The practice, called scrying, had roots stretching back to ancient civilizations, but medieval folks took it to another level entirely. Professional fortune tellers traveled from castle to castle, carrying their precious crystal spheres like modern consultants, with briefcases. Here's the weird part. These weren't cheap carnival attractions. Quality crystal balls cost more than most people earned in months. The clearest specimens came from specific mines, and master craftsmen spent weeks polishing each sphere to perfection. Lords paid handsomely for crystal consultations before major decisions. Makes you wonder what they saw in there, right? Probably about as accurate as checking your horoscope before buying lottery tickets. But honestly, when you're living in an era without weather forecasts, medical scans, or stock market predictions, staring into a crystal ball probably felt like having supernatural Wi-Fi. Speaking of medieval medical practices, wait until you hear what they thought about basic hygiene. Medieval people had some truly bizarre ideas about staying clean. Actually, let me rephrase that. They had ideas about not staying clean. Most folks back then thought bathing was basically asking for trouble. Here's the kicker. They believed washing your body stripped away essential oils that protected you from disease. Talk about backwards thinking. Instead of hopping in a tub, people layered on clothes like they were preparing for Arctic exploration. The idea was that your undergarments would soak up all the sweat and grime, keeping your skin safely dirty. But wait, it gets weirder. Some medieval physicians warned that hot baths opened your pores, making you vulnerable to deadly vapors floating around. Others claimed frequent washing made you weak and effeminate. Imagine explaining that logic to your spouse today. The irony? This fear of cleanliness actually caused the very diseases they were trying to avoid. Poor sanitation led to rampant epidemics that swept through towns like wildfire. Average lifespans were shorter, not despite their hygiene theories, but because of them. And here's my personal favorite bit of medieval madness. Certain warriors believed bathing in specific enchanted waters could make them immune to arrows. Right, because magic water beats proper armor every time. Then there's the absolutely wild world of medieval justice, where even animals weren't safe from courtroom drama. Picture medieval Europe's version of a clearance sale, except instead of discounted electronics, the church was selling forgiveness. Indulgences became Christianity's strangest business model. Pay money, get your sins wiped clean. Brilliant marketing, really. These weren't just for the wealthy either. Peasants scraped together coins while kings dropped fortunes, all believing they could literally purchase their way into heaven. The Pope's sales team traveled across Europe like medieval Amazon Prime, delivering spiritual relief right to your doorstep. But here's where it gets bonkers. You didn't even need cash. Some indulgences were earned through good deeds, pilgrimages, or even participating in the Crusades. Think of it as an early rewards program, except the points were measured. In years off purgatory, instead of airline miles, the whole system grew so ridiculous that people started buying indulgences for sins they hadn't committed yet. Planning to lie to your wife next Tuesday? There's an indulgence for that. It was like spiritual insurance with zero deductible. Of course, this holy hustle eventually backfired spectacularly. Martin Luther took one look at this religious marketplace and basically said, "Are you kidding me?" His famous 95 Theses were essentially a very angry Yelp review that sparked the Protestant Reformation. Well, speaking of people who could get away with almost anything, let's talk about medieval court jesters. Court jesters weren't just goofy entertainers juggling balls for laughs. These guys had one of the most dangerous jobs in medieval times, and probably the most important one too. Think about it this way. If you wanted to tell your boss he's making terrible decisions, you'd probably get fired. But jesters, they could literally mock the king to his face and get paid for it. Wild, right? Here's the thing, though. They weren't just cracking jokes. Jesters served as unofficial political advisors, using humor to deliver harsh truths that nobody else dared speak. When a king's policies were failing miserably, the jester could point it out through clever wordplay and satirical performances. The really brilliant part was their costume. Those colorful, patched outfits with jingling bells weren't just for show. They were like a diplomatic immunity pass. The moment you saw that motley clothing, you knew this person could say absolutely anything without facing execution. And get this, some of the most famous jesters were actually women. Mathurin, for instance, entertained French royalty and got away with roasting nobles on the regular. She probably had better job security than most cabinet ministers. But here's where things get really interesting. The jester's role went way beyond entertainment because medieval medicine had some absolutely bizarre practices that make today's treatments look downright reasonable. Medieval alchemists weren't just crazy old men mixing weird stuff in basements. Well, some were, but hear me out. These guys were basically the first real scientists, just with terrible marketing. Picture this. While everyone else was worried about not dying from the plague, alchemists were busy trying to turn lead into gold. Sounds nuts, right? But here's the kicker. They accidentally invented half the chemistry we use today. Talk about failing upward. The famous philosopher's stone wasn't just some Harry Potter nonsense. Medieval alchemists genuinely believed this magical rock could transform any metal into pure gold. Imagine the medieval equivalent of getting rich quick schemes. Instead of cryptocurrency, they had mysterious stones. But the weird part is how close they actually got to real science. While hunting for impossible gold-making recipes, they discovered distillation techniques that we still use today. They figured out how to make better medicines, stronger acids, and even improve perfumes. Not bad for a bunch of guys chasing fairy tales. The 13th century was peak alchemy time. These dudes wrote instruction manuals that mixed actual chemical processes with complete mystical gibberish. One paragraph would explain legitimate laboratory procedures. The next would discuss communicating with spirits. Many alchemists went completely broke chasing their golden dreams, but their obsession with transformation and purification led to discoveries that changed everything. Sometimes the best inventions come from the worst business plans. Speaking of medieval inventions with staying power, you won't believe what else they created accidentally. Cats in medieval times weren't just cute companions lounging around. They were working professionals with serious job security. Monasteries and churches specifically hired these furry employees for one critical task: keeping rats away from precious manuscripts and food supplies. Think about it like this. Your grandmother's church probably has a donation box, but medieval churches had donation cats. These weren't strays wandering in for scraps. Monks deliberately brought cats into their communities because rats were destroying everything from grain stores to hand-copied books worth more than most people's annual income. The relationship was purely business at first. Cats got food and shelter. Churches got pest control that actually worked. But something funny happened over time. These working cats became so valued that some monasteries started blessing them during religious ceremonies. Talk about employee benefits. What makes this even more interesting? Cats were simultaneously loved and feared in medieval society. Outside church walls, they faced suspicion for their supposed connections to witchcraft, but inside religious buildings, they were practically sacred guardians protecting God's work. Some monasteries kept detailed records of their cats, noting which ones were best mousers and even giving them names. One abbey recorded spending more on cat food than candles in a particularly bad rat year. This practical partnership laid the groundwork for our modern relationship with house cats. But medieval people had other strange medical practices that make cat employment seem perfectly reasonable. Medieval alchemists didn't just chase gold and immortality elixirs. They moonlighted as the world's first fashion designers, creating dyes that literally transformed society's appearance. These wizard chemists discovered that certain colors required the same mystical processes they used for transmuting metals. Tyrian purple, more valuable than actual gold. They crushed thousands of tiny sea snails to create just 1 gram of this legendary dye. Makes today's designer handbag prices look reasonable, doesn't it? But here's where it gets weird. Alchemists believed specific colors held magical properties. Red dyes made from cinnabar weren't just pretty, they supposedly transferred the power of Mercury to whoever wore them. Blue from lapis lazuli connected you to the heavens. Yellow from saffron brought wisdom and divine favor. The process was pure medieval chemistry. They'd grind precious stones, boil exotic insects, and mix in secret ingredients that sound like spell components. Some recipes called for aged wine, others demanded morning dew collected during specific moon phases. Well, the economic impact was staggering. Entire trade routes developed around these magical pigments. Kings bankrupted treasuries for the right shade of royal blue. Common folk saved for years just to afford a single colored thread. The funny thing? Modern synthetic dyes killed this mystical industry overnight, though I bet those alchemists would be fascinated by today's glow-in-the-dark fabrics. Speaking of medieval obsessions that seem downright bizarre today, wait until you hear about their vampire problem. Picture this. Your neighbor dies, but 3 days later, someone swears they saw him wandering around at midnight. What do? Well, if you lived in medieval Europe, you grab a wooden stake and get to work. The fear of vampires wasn't just some gothic fantasy back then, it was dead serious, literally. Entire villages would dig up corpses if they suspected someone had returned from the grave. They'd look for telltale signs like bodies that hadn't decomposed properly or blood around the mouth. Makes you wonder what they'd think of modern embalming, right? But here's where it gets really wild. These weren't random superstitions. Many historians believe vampire scares were actually medieval Europe's way of explaining disease outbreaks. When plague hit a village and bodies started piling up, people needed something to blame. A bloodthirsty undead neighbor? Perfect scapegoat. The methods they used were brutal. Staking through the heart was just the appetizer. Some regions preferred decapitation, stuffing garlic in the mouth, or even burning the entire corpse. Talk about overkill. What's fascinating is how these dark beliefs shaped everything we know about vampire lore today. From Dracula to modern horror movies, it all traces back to terrified medieval peasants with shovels and stakes. Speaking of terrified peasants, wait until you hear about their battles with giant snails. Here's something that'll make you question medieval artists' sanity. Flip through any monastery manuscript from the 13th or 14th centuries, and you'll find knights locked in epic battles. But they're not fighting dragons or rival armies. They're fighting snails. That's right, garden variety, slow-moving, slimy snails. These weren't random doodles either. Over 20% of illuminated manuscripts featured these bizarre snail versus knight showdowns. We're talking about some of the most expensive, carefully crafted books of the era, and scribes consistently chose to draw armored warriors taking on mollusks. The symbolism? Well, that's where it gets interesting. Some scholars think the snail represented the slow, grinding persistence of common folk against the nobility. Others believe it symbolized patience overcoming brute force, like your grandmother always beating you at chess despite your fancy strategies. But here's the kicker. These weren't just tiny margin sketches. Artists devoted serious real estate to these scenes. Knights wielding massive swords, snails rearing up on their, well, whatever snails rear up on. The detail was extraordinary. Maybe medieval artists had the same sense of humor we do about internet cat videos. Or maybe they understood something about life's absurdities that we've forgotten. Either way, they clearly knew that sometimes the smallest opponent poses the biggest challenge. Speaking of unexpected medieval challenges, wait until you hear what people thought the stars could tell them. Medieval folks took stargazing seriously. We're talking about consulting the night sky for everything from when to plant turnips to whether Tuesday was a good day to get married. And honestly, their astrologers had more job security than most Wall Street analysts today. Kings wouldn't make a single major decision without checking their star charts first. Your royal astrologer basically held the same position as today's chief of staff, except with way cooler hats and significantly more crystal balls. These weren't just guys making wild guesses either. They spent years studying planetary movements and celestial patterns. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval astrology wasn't the horoscope nonsense you see in newspapers. These scholars genuinely believed the stars controlled human health, weather patterns, and political outcomes. Doctors would literally refuse to perform surgery unless Mercury was in the right position. Makes you wonder how many appendix operations got postponed because of a cranky constellation. The really wild part? Some of their astronomical calculations were surprisingly accurate. While they were wrong about stars controlling personality traits, their mathematical work on planetary orbits laid groundwork for actual science. Not bad for guys who thought Saturn caused melancholy. Then there's the fact that medieval people used different remedies for ailments, some involving ingredients that would make your skin crawl. Medieval people genuinely believed mandrake roots would let out blood-curdling screams when pulled from the ground. And we're talking about grown adults here, not kids afraid of monsters under the bed. These weird little roots, which honestly do look disturbingly human-shaped, were considered the holy grail of medieval medicine. Apothecaries would pay ridiculous amounts for them. Think of paying your monthly rent for a single carrot, and you're getting close. But here's where it gets really wild. People were so convinced about the deadly screams that they developed elaborate extraction methods. They'd tie the root to a dog, plug their ears with wax, and have the poor animal yank it out while they ran away. Talk about medieval OSHA violations. The irony? These roots were actually poisonous. While folks were jumping through hoops to harvest them safely, they were basically collecting nature's own little poison packages. Medieval doctors used them in potions anyway because apparently logic took a holiday back then. Some entrepreneurial types even carved regular roots into human shapes and sold them as genuine mandrakes to gullible customers. Medieval snake oil salesmen, if you will. Well, speaking of medieval medicine gone wrong, wait until you hear about the secret language builders used to construct those massive cathedrals. Medieval builders had a secret language that would make modern construction crews jealous. They carved mysterious symbols directly into stone blocks, geometric shapes, letters, and bizarre marks that looked like ancient graffiti but served a crucial purpose. These weren't random doodles from bored masons. Each symbol was a precise instruction manual carved in stone. A simple triangle might indicate where a specific archpiece belonged, while crossed lines showed alignment points. Think of it as medieval GPS for cathedral construction, except way more permanent than your phone's battery life. Here's the brilliant part. Most workers couldn't read or write, but they could memorize these visual codes perfectly. A mason from France could walk onto an English building site and immediately understand the stone language. It was like medieval IKEA instructions, but actually useful. The symbols also revealed which guild crafted each piece. Master masons signed their work with personal marks, creating an accountability system that would shame modern contractors. Some stones carry over a dozen different symbols, proof that medieval teamwork required serious coordination. But why all the secrecy? Well, cathedral construction took decades, sometimes centuries. Workers died, moved on, or forgot crucial details. These carved instructions ensured continuity across generations of builders. The weirdest part? Some symbols remain completely mysterious even today. Medieval masons took their secrets seriously. Speaking of medieval mysteries, wait until you hear about their bizarre burial customs. While most medieval Europeans buried their dead in the ground, there was this absolutely wild practice happening thousands of miles away that would make your stomach churn. Sky burials. Yeah, you heard that right. Instead of digging graves, some cultures just left bodies out in the open for the birds. Literally. Picture this. When someone died, their family would carry the body up to a high plateau or mountaintop. Then they'd just leave it there. Vultures, ravens, and other scavengers would do the rest. The whole thing was over in a matter of days. Now, before you start gagging, there was actually some serious logic behind this bizarre ritual. These communities believed the soul had already moved on, so why waste perfectly good meat? Plus, in places like Tibet, where the ground was frozen solid half the year, digging graves was about as practical as trying to plant tomatoes in concrete. But here's the really fascinating part. This wasn't considered disrespectful at all. Quite the opposite. Feeding the birds was seen as a final act of generosity. One last good deed before heading to whatever came next. The whole process symbolized the transition from physical to spiritual existence. Makes you think differently about our own burial customs, doesn't it? Speaking of unusual medieval customs, wait until you hear about the iron collar of shame. Picture getting caught gossiping about your neighbor's terrible cooking, and suddenly you're wearing a metal contraption that makes you look like a medieval robot. Well, that's exactly what happened with the iron collar of shame. This delightful piece of medieval fashion wasn't designed for comfort. The iron collar fit snugly around someone's neck, often weighing several pounds, and came with helpful inscriptions like gossip or scold, just in case anyone missed the point. Think of it as the world's worst name tag. What's fascinating is how this punishment targeted behavior we'd barely notice today. Complaining about your husband snoring, collar time, spreading rumors about the baker's love life. You guessed it. The collar made sure everyone in town knew exactly what you'd done wrong. But here's the twisted logic that actually worked. Public humiliation was often more effective than physical punishment. People feared social ostracism more than a beating. The collar turned the entire community into judge and jury, creating a walking advertisement for proper behavior. The worst part? Some collars came with bells. Imagine trying to sneak anywhere while jingling like a one-person marching band. It's like medieval authorities invented the ultimate anxiety dream. Speaking of medieval justice getting creative with consequences, wait until you hear about their approach to making light itself. Picture medieval nights without electricity. No light switches, no flashlights, just the flickering dance of candlelight keeping the darkness at bay. But here's what most people don't realize. Making candles was basically medieval rocket science. These weren't your modern, store-bought candles. Candle makers were true artists, crafting everything from cheap tallow candles that smelled like a barnyard to luxurious beeswax masterpieces that burned clean and bright. The wealthy didn't just want light, they wanted status symbols that glowed. Here's where it gets wild. Rich families would commission candles with their family crests carved right into the wax. Think of it as medieval Instagram, showing off your wealth one flickering flame at a time. Some artisans spent weeks creating elaborate designs that would melt away in hours. Talk about expensive temporary art. The really fancy ones, pure beeswax, hand-sculpted with intricate patterns. They cost more than most people's monthly wages. Meanwhile, peasants made do with tallow candles that produced more smoke than a faulty barbecue and smelled about as appetizing. Monasteries became candle-making powerhouses, churning out thousands for their endless prayer sessions. They needed reliable light that wouldn't sputter out during midnight masses. But even these master candle crafters couldn't predict the explosive entertainment coming next. Medieval lords didn't just want impressive castle defenses, they wanted spectacle. Enter medieval fireworks, the original blockbuster entertainment that made modern 4th of July celebrations look like birthday candles. Picture this. Gunpowder, originally imported from China for warfare, quickly found its way into tournament festivities. Well, who doesn't love a good explosion? Medieval pyrotechnicians mixed saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal to create dazzling displays that could light up entire castle courtyards. The crowd went wild. But here's where things got interesting. These weren't your safe, regulated fireworks displays. Medieval fire masters basically winged it every single time. No safety protocols, no fire department standing by, just pure medieval chaos with a fuse attached. Makes sense, right? The real kicker? Castle defenders discovered they could integrate these explosive displays into their actual defense systems. Nothing says, "Stay away from my castle," quite like surprise fireworks shooting from the ramparts. Talk about psychological warfare. Some celebrations ended in spectacular disasters. Records show entire wooden viewing platforms going up in flames, guests diving for cover, and more than a few singed eyebrows. Yet people kept coming back for more. The thrill was apparently worth the risk of becoming human toast. Then there's the sheer unpredictability that made each display a genuine gamble with physics. So we've covered some bizarre medieval practices, but here's where things get absolutely ridiculous. Picture a courtroom. The defendant stands accused of murder. The judge bangs his gavel. And the accused? A pig. I'm not joking. Medieval courts regularly put animals on trial for crimes against humans. Pigs were the usual suspects, but locusts, rats, and even roosters faced legal proceedings. These weren't symbolic gestures either. They were full trials with prosecutors, evidence, and verdicts. In 1497, a sow in France was tried for murdering a 5-year-old. The court appointed legal counsel for the pig. Think your lawyer bills are high now? The defense argued the pig acted without malicious intent. The prosecution demanded justice for the grieving family. After deliberation, the pig was found guilty and publicly hanged. But wait, it gets weirder. Some animals even won their cases. A group of weevils destroying crops in 1509 successfully argued through their lawyer that they deserved access to food. The court actually set aside land for them to eat freely. Why did this happen? Medieval people believed animals could sin and needed to face divine justice. Plus, public trials reinforced social order. If even pigs faced consequences, humans certainly would too. These trials lasted until the 18th century. Makes you wonder what other strange legal practices existed, doesn't it? Well, speaking of unusual medieval justice, The maiden's mill wasn't your typical workplace punishment. This twisted medieval institution forced women into grueling labor for offenses that would barely raise an eyebrow today. Gossiping too much? Off to the mill. Speaking back to your husband? Time to grind grain until your hands bled. These weren't just regular mills either. They were designed as public spectacles where entire communities could watch unruly women learn their place. The irony? Many of these facilities were more productive than regular mills because desperation makes for motivated workers. But here's where it gets really bizarre. Some women actually volunteered for mill duty to escape worse punishments or abusive households. Talk about choosing the devil you know. The work was backbreaking, sure, but at least you got fed regularly and had a roof over your head. The whole system was basically medieval society's way of saying, we'll break your spirit through exhaustion. Guards would rotate shifts to ensure no woman got a moment's rest during daylight hours. Makes today's workplace complaints seem pretty trivial, doesn't it? What made this even more twisted was how it became a twisted form of entertainment for locals. Families would bring picnics to watch the show. Well, if you think forced labor mills were bad, wait until you hear about the church's strangest invention. Ever wonder why the Catholic Church would deliberately hire someone to argue against making someone a saint? Well, they literally created a job called the devil's advocate for exactly that purpose. This wasn't some Hollywood drama. The church invented this position to make sure they weren't accidentally canonizing frauds or lunatics. The devil's advocate's job was to dig up dirt, poke holes in miracles, and basically be the ultimate skeptic. Think of it as medieval fact-checking, but with eternal consequences. Here's the kicker. They were required to argue against the candidate, even if they personally believed the person deserved sainthood. Talk about professional dedication. It's like being forced to criticize your grandmother's cooking when you secretly love it. The process was brutal. Out of roughly 500 cases where someone was proposed for sainthood, fewer than 100 actually made it through. That's a worse success rate than most dating apps. The devil's advocate would challenge everything, from alleged miracles to the candidate's character flaws. What makes this brilliant is how it prevented the church from making embarrassing mistakes. No organization wants to canonize someone only to discover later they were secretly running a medieval gambling ring. But here's something even stranger about medieval justice. It wasn't just about arguing against saints. Sometimes they put creatures on trial that couldn't even speak for themselves. Medieval knights didn't just ride horses, they rode four-legged life insurance policies with the intelligence of a seeing-eye dog. These weren't your average barn animals trotting around with hay breath. War horses received training that would put modern service animals to shame. They learned to strike enemies with their hooves, bite on command, and even retrieve their fallen riders' weapons. Some could navigate battlefields blindfolded, relying purely on sound and their riders' weight shifts. Talk about GPS before satellites existed. But here's where it gets expensive. Maintaining a proper war horse cost more than feeding a family of 6 for a year. Knights needed backup horses, pack horses, and specialized breeding stock. One destrier, that's fancy talk for a knight's main battle horse, could cost as much as a modern luxury car. These animals became living symbols of social status. The bigger and more magnificent your horse, the more respect you commanded. Knights without proper steeds were basically showing up to a board meeting in flip-flops. The bond between knight and horse often lasted decades. Some horses learned their riders' combat patterns so well they'd anticipate moves before commands were given. When a knight died, his horse sometimes refused to accept a new rider. Well, speaking of medieval survival tactics, let me tell you about some creative youngsters who developed their own ingenious methods. Picture this, gangs of kids roaming medieval streets, but instead of smartphones, they're armed with sob stories and acrobatic tricks. These weren't your average troublemakers. They were survival artists. Medieval street children, or urchins, developed elaborate schemes that would make modern con artists jealous. They'd position themselves near churches during Mass, knowing guilt-ridden nobles would toss coins their way. Smart little devils, really. But here's where it gets interesting. These kids weren't just begging randomly. They formed actual gangs with hierarchies, territories, and specialized roles. Some were tumblers who performed backflips and handstands. Others were weepers, professional criers who could summon tears on command. Makes you wonder if Hollywood got its start in medieval alleyways, right? The really clever ones learned multiple languages to target foreign merchants. Imagine a 10-year-old switching from broken French to butchered German, all to squeeze a few extra pennies from traveling traders. These urchin gangs created their own family structures too. Older kids protected younger ones, sharing food and shelter. They had their own codes, their own justice systems. It was like a miniature society operating in the shadows of the real one. Well, speaking of shadows and survival, wait until you hear about the knights who depended on four-legged partners with intelligence that could literally save their lives in battle. Picture a knight in full armor. We're talking about a walking tank that could stop a crossbow bolt dead in its tracks. But here's the kicker. These metal masterpieces weren't just protection, they were basically medieval status symbols worth more than your average peasant's entire village. A full suit of plate armor weighed between 66 and 77 pounds. That's like strapping a large golden retriever to your body and then trying to sword fight. Most people think knights clanked around like tin cans, but skilled armorers crafted these suits so precisely that a knight could literally pick up a coin from the ground while fully suited up. The really wild part? Custom armor cost about the same as 15 war horses. We're talking serious money here, enough to buy a decent-sized farm. And if you got captured wearing the good stuff, enemies would sometimes forge replacement armor overnight just to ransom you back properly equipped. Talk about medieval customer service. But there's a darker side. Less experienced soldiers often died from heat exhaustion before they ever saw combat. The wait wasn't just inconvenient, it was potentially lethal in summer campaigns. Makes you wonder what other medieval must-haves came with deadly side effects, right? Well, speaking of things that could literally heal or kill you depending on who was wielding them. Medieval kings had a bizarre side hustle that would make modern chiropractors jealous. They claimed they could cure a nasty skin disease called scrofula just by touching people. Yeah, you heard that right. Royal healing hands. This wasn't some underground operation either. The church officially endorsed it, turning these healing sessions into elaborate ceremonies. Kings would line up hundreds of sick folks, touch their necks, and supposedly cure their tuberculosis of the lymph nodes. Talk about putting pressure on your job performance. The French called it the king's evil, which is ironic since the king was supposed to be the cure, not the cause. English monarchs got so into this gig that they'd hand out special gold coins called touch pieces after each healing session. Nothing says I cured your disease like a commemorative coin, right? But here's the kicker. People actually believed it worked. Why? Because sometimes patients did get better, probably through good old-fashioned placebo effect mixed with natural recovery. The kings weren't complaining, though. This divine healing power basically proved they were God's chosen rulers on earth. Charles II reportedly touched over 90,000 people during his reign. That's more patients than most doctors see in a lifetime. Makes you wonder if he ever thought about charging co-pays. Speaking of medieval medical practices, wait until you hear about their approach to romance and marriage contracts. Medieval marriage wasn't exactly a fairy tale romance. Well, not unless your idea of romance involves haggling over dowries like you're buying a used cart at the market. Here's the thing nobody tells you about medieval love. It came with a literal price tag. Families negotiated marriage contracts that read more like business mergers than love letters. The bride's family paid a dowry, while the groom's family offered a bride price. Makes modern prenups look downright romantic, doesn't it? But wait, it gets weirder. Some regions charged actual taxes on marriages. That's right, the government wanted their cut of your happily ever after. Talk about wedding expenses you didn't see coming. These marriage taxes supposedly ensured only suitable unions took place, but really they just made the state richer. The Catholic Church also got in on the action, requiring fees for ceremonies and special permissions. Want to marry your third cousin? That'll cost extra. Need a quick ceremony during Lent? Better open your wallet wider. Political marriages were basically medieval stock trades. Daughters became bargaining chips for land deals, peace treaties, and trade agreements. Love was about as relevant as Wi-Fi passwords. The paperwork alone could bankrupt smaller families. Marriage contracts detailed everything from property rights to what happened if someone died childless. Speaking of medieval mysteries that boggle the mind, you won't believe what people thought about basic hygiene. Medieval harvest festivals weren't your typical church potlucks. These were epic community blowouts where everyone, and I mean everyone, got absolutely hammered together. Picture entire villages transforming into massive outdoor parties. Peasants who barely had enough grain to survive suddenly found themselves feasting like kings. Well, sort of. The irony? During harvest season, even the poorest folks could stuff their faces with fresh bread, roasted meats, and gallons of ale. These weren't quiet, dignified celebrations either. We're talking about full-blown medieval ragers that lasted for days. Dancing, singing, drinking contests, the works. Makes modern music festivals look tame, honestly. But here's what's fascinating. These festivals accidentally created the most egalitarian moments in medieval society. Lords mingled with serfs. Everyone shared the same tables, and social boundaries temporarily dissolved. Your typical feudal hierarchy, gone faster than free beer at a college party. The religious angle made it even better. Since they were technically thanking God for the harvest, nobody could complain about the excess. Brilliant loophole, right? Sorry, Father, but the Lord wants us to celebrate His bounty. These massive community parties shape traditions we still follow today. Our modern Thanksgiving dinners, direct descendants of these medieval beer-fueled harvest celebrations. Speaking of medieval professionals, let me tell you about some folks who combine two very different job descriptions. Medieval tapestries weren't just fancy wall decorations for rich people. They were basically the Netflix of their time, telling epic stories thread by thread. But here's the kicker. Creating one of these masterpieces took decades. Some tapestries were literally passed down from grandmother to granddaughter before completion. The Bayeux Tapestry stretches over 230 feet long. That's like laying out 2.5 basketball courts end to end. And get this, it's not even technically a tapestry. It's embroidery. Medieval people were terrible at naming things, apparently. These fabric storytellers depicted everything from biblical scenes to grocery shopping adventures. Well, maybe not grocery shopping, but definitely everyday life mixed with grand battles and religious tales. The threads became time machines, preserving moments that would have been lost forever. The really wild part? Wealthy families used tapestries as portable insulation. When they moved between castles, because apparently having multiple castles was a thing, they'd roll up these priceless artworks and hang them in their new digs for warmth. Imagine using a Picasso as a blanket. Some tapestries contain secret messages woven into the designs. Political commentary disguised as pretty flowers and geometric patterns makes you wonder what medieval artists really thought about their bosses. Speaking of medieval craftspeople with attitude, wait until you hear about the barber surgeons who cut your hair and amputate your leg in the same appointment. Need a haircut and surgery? Well, in medieval times, you could get both from the same guy. Barber surgeons were the ultimate multi-talented professionals of their era. These weren't your typical corner barbershop owners. While trimming your beard, they'd also pull teeth, set broken bones, and perform amputations. Talk about a full-service experience. The red and white striped barber pole we still see today? That comes from these medieval jack-of-all-trades. Red represented blood, white symbolized bandages, and the pole itself mimicked the stick patients gripped during procedures. Here's the kicker. They learned their craft through apprenticeships, not medical school. Your barber might have zero formal training beyond watching someone else hack off limbs. Makes you appreciate modern licensing requirements, doesn't it? But here's what's truly bizarre. They were often more successful than university-trained physicians. While doctors debated theoretical humors and consulted ancient texts, barber surgeons got their hands dirty with real experience. They understood practical anatomy because they actually cut people open regularly. The guild system regulated these multi-skilled workers, ensuring standards existed, though those standards were, let's say, flexible by today's measures. A steady hand for shaving translated surprisingly well to surgical precision. However, there's something even stranger about medieval medical practices that'll make barber surgeons seem perfectly reasonable. Picture medieval monks wandering through carefully tended gardens, not picking flowers for decoration, but hunting for life-saving remedies. These weren't your grandmother's vegetable patches. They were sophisticated pharmaceutical laboratories disguised as peaceful sanctuaries. Apothecary gardens served as the original drugstores, where every plant had a purpose. Monks meticulously cultivated herbs like foxglove for heart conditions, willow bark for pain relief, and chamomile for digestive troubles. Well, at least they tried to match the right plant with the right problem. But here's where things get deliciously dark. Many gardens included what they cheerfully called poison corners. dedicated sections for growing deadly plants specifically for experimental study. Nothing says holy sanctuary like a patch of hemlock next to the healing herbs, right? These green thumb monks kept detailed records of every plant's properties, essentially creating the first herbal encyclopedias. Their observations formed the foundation of botanical medicine that we still reference today. Some of their remedies actually worked, though others probably sent patients straight to meet their maker. The irony? While they were growing plants to heal bodies, they were simultaneously cultivating knowledge that would eventually challenge the church's monopoly on medical authority. Speaking of medieval medical practices that raise eyebrows, wait until you hear about the traveling toothpullers who combine dental work with street entertainment. Picture this. You're walking through a medieval village when suddenly you hear screaming, dramatic music, and what sounds like a street performance. But it's not a show. It's the local toothpuller at work. These traveling dental experts roamed from town to town with nothing more than rusty pliers and questionable hygiene. Well, that's not entirely fair. They also brought entertainment. See, these toothpullers knew their job was terrifying, so they turned it into theater. They'd hire musicians, tell jokes, and sometimes even juggle before yanking out your molars. The whole spectacle served a purpose beyond showmanship. The music drowned out the screams, and the comedy distracted patients from the fact that anesthesia wouldn't be invented for another few centuries. Makes your last dental visit seem like a spa day, right? But here's where it gets really wild. More. People died from tooth extraction then actually felt better afterward. These professionals had zero medical training and often caused massive infections. They'd literally pull the wrong tooth, break your jaw, or leave fragments behind. The truly bizarre part? They mixed prayer with pliers. Many tooth pullers genuinely believed that chanting the right incantation while extracting would prevent complications. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Speaking of questionable medieval medical practices, wait until you hear what physicians were doing underground in secret gatherings. Picture medieval Christians sneaking into ancient burial chambers for secret parties. Well, that's exactly what happened during Catacomb festivals. These underground celebrations mixed religion with pure madness. People would descend into dark tunnels lined with bones and painted murals, carrying flickering candles that cast eerie shadows on decomposing walls. Makes your local church potluck seem pretty tame, right? But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't just spooky gatherings for kicks. Communities used catacombs for coming-of-age ceremonies, religious rites, and yes, actual feasts among the dead. Think of it as the medieval version of extreme dining experiences, except your table mates had been there for centuries. The atmosphere was deliberately theatrical, candles everywhere, ancient bones arranged as decorations, and those haunting painted murals telling stories of saints and sinners. Some participants claimed they could commune with spirits or receive divine visions in these sacred spaces. Church authorities weren't thrilled about this underground party scene. Records show many catacomb festivals were officially banned for moral dangers. Apparently, mixing wine, darkness, and death made people a bit too adventurous for medieval sensibilities. These events strengthened community bonds through shared terror and reverence. Nothing brings people together quite like celebrating life while surrounded by reminders of mortality. And speaking of medieval parties that authorities tried to control, medieval mirrors weren't the crystal clear reflections we're used to today. They were polished metal discs that gave you about as much clarity as looking at yourself in a spoon. But here's the kicker. People treated these blurry metal circles like they were worth their weight in gold. A decent mirror could cost more than a horse. That's like paying $50,000 for a funhouse reflection. Wealthy nobles had servants whose entire job was polishing these things daily. Talk about a specialized career path. But wait, it gets weirder. People genuinely believe mirrors could trap souls or reveal spirits lurking nearby. Some folks refused to look into them after dark, convinced they'd see something staring back that shouldn't be there. Medieval horror movies would have been terrifying with beliefs like that floating around. The really wild part? Courts used mirrors as the ultimate flex. Having multiple mirrors meant you'd basically won medieval life. Kings would position them strategically so visitors would catch glimpses of themselves and remember exactly who they were dealing with. Pretty clever psychological warfare, if you ask me. These distorted reflections shaped how people saw themselves, literally and figuratively. Makes you wonder how different self-perception might have been when your mirror made you look like a funky medieval caricature. Speaking of medieval entertainment, traveling performers had their own fascinating secrets. Picture a medieval town square buzzing with excitement. Well, here comes a wandering minstrel with his lute, ready to drop the hottest gossip from 3 kingdoms away. These guys were basically the medieval internet, social media, and entertainment industry all rolled into one person. Minstrels didn't just strum pretty songs about love and roses. They were walking newspapers who could make or break a king's reputation faster than you could say trending topic. One catchy ballad about a corrupt lord, that guy's political career was toast. Think of them as medieval influencers, except their follower count was measured in actual crowds, not digital likes. But here's where it gets really interesting. These musical nomads often earned more coin during festival seasons than local blacksmiths or bakers made all year. Not bad for someone whose office was literally the road, right? The smart ones knew exactly how to read their audience. Performing for nobles, time for elegant courtly romance, tavern full of farmers. Bring out the bawdy jokes and drinking songs. They were masters of knowing their market before marketing was even a thing. Some minstrels even received legal protection as bearers of culture. Imagine having diplomatic immunity because you could carry a tune. But while these musical messengers shaped hearts and minds, medieval cities faced a much less romantic problem that required equally specialized professionals. Medieval cities had a serious problem: rats everywhere. These weren't your average house mice. We're talking about armies of disease-carrying rodents that could wipe out entire food stores overnight. Well, enter the rat catchers, the unsung heroes of medieval pest control. These guys were basically the Navy SEALs of vermin warfare. They'd show up with an arsenal that would make a modern exterminator jealous: traps, ferrets, and sometimes even trained hunting dogs. The ferrets were particularly effective because they could chase rats into their tunnels, kind of like sending a tiny missile into enemy territory. But here's where it gets interesting. Many cities paid rat catchers by the tail. Imagine explaining that job at a medieval dinner party. Oh, I collect rat tails for a living. Talk about conversation starters. Some entrepreneurial rat catchers figured out they could breed rats just to kill them for the bounty. Medieval side hustles were wild. The really successful ones became municipal employees. Cities would actually provide housing and steady wages because good rat catchers were worth their weight in gold. Makes sense, right? One rat catcher could prevent famines and plagues that would devastate entire populations. Speaking of preventing plagues, medieval physicians had their own bizarre solutions for dealing with disease. Medieval doctors had a truly disturbing secret ingredient in their medicine cabinets: human remains. Yeah, you heard that right. They literally prescribed dead people as medicine. Powdered skull was considered a top-tier remedy for epilepsy. Makes your daily vitamins seem pretty tame, doesn't it? Physicians would grind up skulls, mix them into potions, and serve them to patients with complete confidence. The fresher the corpse, the better the medicine, they believed. But wait, it gets weirder. Mummy powder became the Rolex of medieval remedies. Wealthy patients paid outrageous prices for imported Egyptian mummies, ground into fine powder. These ancient corpses were supposedly miracle cures for bleeding disorders and various ailments. The logic was twisted but consistent in their minds. They figured death held some mystical power that could cure the living, like borrowing strength from the deceased. Medieval physicians treated human remains like we treat exotic supplements today: expensive, rare, and supposedly life-changing. Here's the kicker. This wasn't some underground practice. Respectable doctors openly prescribed corpse medicine across Europe. Medical texts included detailed recipes for preparing human-based remedies. The whole thing was perfectly legal and socially acceptable. Of course, patients probably caught more diseases than they cured, considering they were literally eating decomposed bodies. But hey, at least they felt confident about their treatment plan, right? Speaking of confidence and questionable medieval innovations, wait until you hear about their revolutionary approach to measuring time. Picture a world where nobody agrees on what time it is. One monastery rings bells at dawn, another waits for full sunrise. Towns operate on pure guesswork. Chaos, right? Then came the mechanical clock revolution in the 13th and 14th centuries. These weren't your grandpa's wristwatches. We're talking massive tower contraptions that literally changed civilization. The first mechanical clocks used weights, gears, and escapements to tick away the hours with shocking precision. But here's the kicker. These clocks weren't just timepieces, they were medieval entertainment systems. Many featured elaborate automata that would pop out on the hour. Dancing figures, jousting knights, even mechanical roosters that crowed. The clock in Strasbourg had a parade of apostles marching around Christ every noon. Talk about dinner and a show, the real game changer. Standardized time meant coordinated work schedules. No more, I'll meet you when the sun's kinda high-ish. Suddenly, everyone knew exactly when to start work, attend mass, or close shop. It was like giving medieval society a universal remote control. These mechanical marvels cost fortunes to build and maintain. Only the wealthiest cities could afford them, making public clocks the ultimate status symbol. Venice, Paris, London, they all competed for the most impressive timekeeper. Well, speaking of medieval society's quirks, you won't believe the bizarre superstitions that controlled people's daily decisions. Medieval people had some seriously strange superstitions that would make your horoscope-checking aunt look rational. Black cats weren't just unlucky pets. They were basically furry death omens walking around on four legs. Makes you wonder how any cats survived the Middle Ages, right? But here's where it gets really weird. Spilling salt wasn't just wasteful, it was practically signing your own death warrant. People would throw pinches over their left shoulder like their lives depended on it, which, according to them, it absolutely did. The left shoulder thing? That's where the devil supposedly hung out, waiting to cause trouble. Walking under ladders was another big no-no. Though, honestly, that one actually makes sense. Have you ever seen medieval construction safety standards? Those ladders were basically death traps held together with hope and splinters. Then there's the really bizarre stuff. People believed that breaking a mirror cursed you for 7 years. Considering mirrors cost more than most people's houses, breaking one probably did ruin your finances for 7 years. Talk about a self-fulfilling prophecy. These weren't just random quirks either. Superstitions influenced everything from when farmers planted crops to how judges decided court cases. Wedding dates, business deals, even which direction you stirred your porridge. It all mattered. The funny thing, some of these beliefs stuck around so well that your grandmother probably still follows half of them.